So thank you all for joining us today. What we're going to do today is ask one big question, and that question is, what does WaterFire do for Providence? It seems to me that this is a fundamental question for creative placemaking, and the way we phrase this, the do for, is an intentionally open-ended way of phrasing it. Traditionally, in creative placemaking, what it does for has been about economic impact. And there are well-known methodologies for examining the economic impacts of festivals, events, and the like. So we want to look at this a little bit more broadly. We want to know how does WaterFire make people feel about Providence? We're going to do this by breaking this into three smaller questions. How does WaterFire make people feel about it? What do those feelings do for the city? And how does a social, artistic event like WaterFire change ideas and behaviors? So we're looking here at feelings, at events. The word that I'll use later on is affect. How does emotions and movement and emotion change the way people feel about the city? Does it encourage them to bring other people to the city? Does it encourage them to move here? Does it encourage them to go to restaurants? Those are the sort of questions that we're going to ask. So let me start off, though, with a few caveats and a few remarks. First of all, what you're going to see here is very much preliminary results. A class project has a certain rhythm to it. It takes place over the course of a semester, and we're only halfway through. And so we have, this is preliminary work that we will know more as we keep working on it. Next thing is what we've done here is very much accessible methodologies. This is a cheaply run project. In fact, one of the people this morning talked about if you need evaluation done, talk to a local university. They can help you. Well, we are exactly a case study of that. The two classes, the two groups of students here, you can see Professor Motte's Metropolitan Providence, Past, Present, and Future, and the Public Humanities students from Brown University. So I'm going to quickly give you a literature review just to tell you what we're coming out of, where our work is coming from. What you see here, the first three are sort of standard. This is what every creative placemaking evaluation thinks about, which is the market research, tourism literature, placemaking literature, and we're adding on there cultural studies, which maybe in place of economics, we do cultural studies. Maybe that's the future for the humanities at the university. So that's another talk. Our market research, we are not doing profound market research. There are a lot of people out there already doing that. We are not looking at competitive research. We're not looking at target markets or market segmentation. We are going to use the Net Promoter Score as a very simple way of analyzing things. We know that there are challenges with it, but we'll talk about that later. The tourism literature that we're looking at is mostly around the question of who shall we attract? What markets are likely to come and visit us? What do you need to build? This project at Atlantic City was basically, how do people feel about Atlantic City? What can we do to make them feel better about Atlantic City? Atlantic City has an interesting challenge. Is when you ask people whether they like the city, whether they're satisfied with it, the problem there is that if they lost at gambling, they're unhappy about the city. Providence doesn't have that problem yet. Creative placemaking, I guess we don't really need to say because that's what the whole conference is about. This is about shaping the character of a city around arts and cultural activities. At the end, it may be about economics, but it's as much about diverse people moving to the city, about community. What makes it so interesting and what the sessions this morning made pretty clear is there are lots and lots of different ways to evaluate creative placemaking, from economic impact to vibrancy indicators. We're going to think about the world of cultural studies and affect theory, an interest in how culture shapes feeling and action. It seems that for WaterFire, this is the right way to think about this world. WaterFire is about a social event that has feelings, has emotion. Affect theory directly addresses those kind of issues. How do you deal with that magical combination of place and emotion? So let me move on and talk about the surveys. I'm going to pass this down to the next speaker here, who was responsible for helping out with collecting those. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Lubar. I like the ambiance in here. It's much akin to WaterFire night itself, and actually it's very similar to the atmosphere that existed when a lot of the surveys were administered. What we did, we had several different components to the research element, and included the actual WaterFire audience itself. We had about 268 survey respondents there, and that was done over the course of 2 different nights of WaterFires in the last few weeks. And Rhode Island College students went out, clipboards in hand, and asked a series of questions to respondents, sort of at random, whenever they were able to grab someone, basically, all around the WaterFire basin. Basically had teams positioned throughout the area. We also, almost as a control group, went out to the New Bedford Working Waterfront Festival as well, which is a similar sort of event. It takes place, of course, on the water. It has a strong identity with its host city. We had a smaller sample size, but not by a great margin, but a smaller sample size taken there as well. And then additionally, of course, we had surveys conducted on nights where Providence did not have a WaterFire, just so we could look at the differences there, as well as the New Bedford without its Working Waterfront Festival. A couple other components there. The online survey was also conducted. We'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit further on in the presentation. And the real-time data gathering, we're going to address that a little bit further along as well. Now, towards our next slide, you can actually see copy one of the surveys there. Just a brief run through of the survey process. Again, a group of 1 or 2 students would go up to an attendee at WaterFire at the New Bedford Waterfront Festival, or just in downtown Providence or in New Bedford in the same geographic area on the given night, and they would basically say, why did you choose to come to WaterFire today? And on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely do you recommend that a friend visit downtown Providence? And as Professor Lubar alluded to earlier, what we're looking for is more of an emotional response here. We weren't too interested in the economic side. We weren't too interested in some other, more like a marketing survey would conduct. But we were looking for an emotional response. We were looking to see what was the true impact that these attendees had or didn't have on a non-WaterFire night or a non-working waterfront festival afternoon. So that's the reason for those questions. And we asked them their specific reasons. Again, that was an excellent way to draw out some more buzzwords, some more emotional words, which we're also going to talk about a little bit further in the presentation. In a way related to the economic side, we did ask, what else did you do tonight in the city, either before or after the event? Did you go out for dinner? Did you attend a movie? Did you shop at the mall? And we asked that as a very open-ended question, and whatever the respondents provided us, we took down notes as detailed as we could, given the lighting conditions, of course, on a WaterFire night. But we were able to go back and obviously reread our handwriting. And including this evening, how many times have you attended a WaterFire in the last 2 years? And that turned out to be pretty useful as well in analyzing the data and cross-tabulating a lot of information as to how many times, if an attendee goes to one of these events, does that change the emotional impact it has upon them? And of course, we asked them for the zip code, and that generally was just get a good idea of what geographic area they were coming from. Okay?
Thanks. The other one. Great, thanks. In order to measure, sort of the key measure that we were using was the ultimate question, as Reichheld calls it, which is just simply how likely is it you would recommend us to a friend? And we asked them to respond on a scale from 1 to 10. And essentially, the way that they code it in the Net Promoter Score system is that anyone who answers a 9 or a 10 is a promoter, anyone who answers a 6 or below is a detractor, and anyone who answers a 7 or 8 is a passive. And basically, promoters are people who are likely to stick with you and also are likely to try and get other people to come to you. And detractors are people who are likely to defect, and they're probably not going to stick around, and also they will sort of not be kind when they're talking about you to other people. Passives tend not to have a huge impact on people's public perception of your organization or your product. So the actual Net Promoter Score is a number that is basically the percentage of promoters minus the percentage of detractors, and it'll spit out a number that is somewhere between negative 100 and positive 100. So next slide. Great. So obviously this does come out of marketing research, and so these are some examples of corporations that use the Net Promoter System and what sort of results they have. So on the left side, you have sort of the stars of various areas. So you have Southwest Airlines, for instance, that has a Net Promoter Score of 66, which compared to the average for airlines is only 30. So they're doing pretty well. But moving along, we wanted to actually kind of take it into a different realm. So again, some of the best systems out there are related to marketing research, but we wanted to take it back to this more affect-oriented sort of approach. So these are some cities that actually use the system to measure the quality of their city, mostly from the perspective of a tourist, though. So it's still about a commodity. It's are you going to come to the city? Are you going to buy the ticket? Are you going to get the hotel room? But it's still interesting to actually compare these because some of our respondents are visitors and others are locals. So it's a little bit different, but it gives us a baseline for comparison. So yeah, moving on. So this is just one specific example. This is Bend, Oregon. Most of these other cities were incredibly hard to actually find these scores. They're not very publicly available, but Bend, Oregon was fairly easy to access. So you can see a little bit of how they've used this to segment some of their research. They're mostly using it to look at demographics. So for instance, what kind of households give different Net Promoter Scores. The two sections we've called out there are more similar to the type of research we're doing, more related to behaviors. So for instance, first-time visitors versus people who have visited before. We also tied it more to ideas, reasons why you came, and those sorts of things. Okay. And these are just the caveats that Steve sort of brought up a little bit before. We need more surveys and more controlled surveying. Again, just given the limitations of doing it within a class, we want to continue improving that. We need more sophisticated statistics. For instance, we didn't gather a lot of demographic data, and that might give us another way to compare things. We need more comparisons. So again, there's very few cities that use the Net Promoter Score as a way, especially to measure locals' feelings about their city. So it would be helpful to have more cities that do that, but also events. There aren't very many events that use, like WaterFire, for instance, that use this system. So having those as a point of comparison would be useful. And also, lastly, we are asking for feelings about the city, but often when respondents gave their answers, they were talking mostly about WaterFire rather than the city itself. Okay. So I'm just going to pass this along.
So one of the questions in asking our respondents, we wanted to get to know the visitors, as we've talked about, more past the demographics, more so, but the appeal that comes with the visitor. So as we talked about before in the previous slide, there was some information that we really would like to know more about. Maybe that would help us make better correlations with the data that we do have and be able to use our deductive reasoning further. One of the questions we ask are, what do our visitors think? What else are they going to do in the area? And we kind of, as we've been talking about, the two terms we've been using are the visitors and the locals. The locals we've defined not just as those who live in the Providence area, but mostly the state of Rhode Island and parts of southeastern Massachusetts and a couple of points north. Anyone who outlies that is considered a visitor. With the data that we collected from surveys, we were able to put those into GIS maps. The class sitting here was able to do some hard work to help us put these maps together and really pinpoint where we have the clusters of people visiting on WaterFire nights and, more importantly, non-WaterFire nights, which helped with the control of the project. Again, finding out where our people come from. This is kind of appealing to the market research that we wanted to stay away from, but obviously this is essential information that we need in needing to know who attends in the future for the future of WaterFire in appealing to those market bases. What else are they doing there? What brought them to Providence in the first place? Anything that surrounds that, which we'll appeal more to in the further on in the presentation, talking about what were the main attractors of WaterFire. And here we have a map of WaterFire Providence, where the visitors come from on a night when there is a water fire. And as it says here, no surprises here really. Obviously the cluster coming from the downtown Providence area, and the reach going up into close to southern Maine, which I find really surprising. The tip there next to Kittery, and it reaches all the way down to New York and New Jersey. But then again, we know that New York area is pretty much a foodie area, especially from the city area, where they have constantly bus routes up to the city. And as we look at the enlarged map of the United States there to your right on the bottom, we see that the reach has some outliers as well from California, Texas, Florida, some areas of Canada. Personally, when I was out for the September 28th WaterFire giving surveys, the Texas respondents were because there was a conference in town, and they said that it was the #1 recommended thing to do while they were in the city. So that obviously is providing some information that I probably wrote on the back of the survey that I hope we take into account later on to have more comprehensive and sophisticated data that we look at. But definitely something that it's not just that WaterFire promoting itself, but the city has latched on and they're doing their part to promote it as well, knowing the type of impact and the benefits that the event provides. And here we have a non-WaterFire Providence night, and much more local audience. You don't see any outliers there on the right enlarged map, and not even too much of a driving distance audience. Nobody's coming in when there isn't that big draw, the big crowd of people, and the evangelization of bringing people together with that one event. Providence just seems to be, a lot more relaxed, just more everyday business when we don't have the creative placemaking event, as you can see there.
All right, as you can see here, this is an example of a word cloud or a wordle, which is, in a sense, just a fancy graph. And basically what we did here, we took buzzwords that were on the surveys, and we put them into this database where we could make a fun-looking graph out of them. So the words that are bigger, like WaterFire and friends and time and recommended, they're going to be a lot larger, and that means that specific buzzword was shown more on the surveys. And same as some of the smaller words, they came up less. And this is actually a specific example of the question, why did you choose to come to WaterFire tonight? So as you can see, the biggest word there is WaterFire. So that was the main attractant to why you were there. But there's also things like RWU, recommendations from a friend, your visiting family. So that's pretty fun. And the reasons we use this is just a little bit more interesting than just looking at a graph, and it looks nice. It really is. Next slide, please. And this Wordle is set up from the question, what were the reasons for your answer on the 1 to 10 scale? So and actually there's a pretty cool correlation between this and a survey we did in, where was the survey?
New Bedford?
New Bedford, thank you. So, but I'll get to that in a second. But this was, so a lot of the answers were things like atmosphere and relaxing and music and beautiful. And if you go to actually the next slide, you have 2 more Wordles from New Bedford, and you get a lot of words like restaurants and dining and shops, and it's a lot more nouns rather than adjectives. So that was a really interesting thing we found while making these Wordles, and it's really something you wouldn't have noticed without doing them. I think that's really all I have to say on that.
Thank you. So I'm going to go through some of the actual results that came up. We got the data, we pulled it all in, and we started doing a lot of number crunching to see what kind of stories we could pull out from the data. Excuse me. So we're looking at what do our visitors think. We used the Net Promoter Score system that we've talked about. We've talked about the surveys that we did on site at WaterFire and at the New Bedford Working Waterfront Festival, and at those two sites when the events weren't taking place. We also ran a survey online. We tried to target Providence residents to try and get a sense of if there were any correlation between Providence residents on site and Providence residents more generally. So again, we're looking at first-time visitors, repeat visitors, and where they are from. So the Net Promoter Scores from on-site. This is from Providence, not at WaterFire, and then Providence during WaterFire. And you can see the green figures there at the bottom of each of those quadrants. The Net Promoter Score during a WaterFire event is plus 63, which drops down to plus 30 not at WaterFire event. So this is the same place, the same time on a Saturday evening, with or without the event. And you can see a marked score, even though the net score is still positive. When we went to New Bedford, you'll see a bigger difference. So during the Working Waterfront Festival, a positive score of 57. New Bedford on a Saturday night, not a very busy place, ends up being a -4 score, which means there are more people giving that 1 to 6, the detractor score, than there are people giving a positive score. So let's have a look at some fancy graphs. So these are the results of the question: how likely are you to recommend that a friend comes to Providence? Pie chart on the left is the results from on-site at the WaterFire events, and on the right is the pie chart for the online survey that we did. The green areas you can see are the promoters, and the red is the detractor scores. I think the next slide combines these together, online and on-site, and we end up with a Net Promoter Score of 42. Scooch down. One of the interesting stories that we pulled out was when we cross-tabulated the frequency of visits to WaterFire with excuse me, the Net Promoter Score. The story from this graph is that there's a very clear correlation between how likely you are to recommend Providence to a friend and how often you come to WaterFire. So the more often you've been to WaterFire in the last couple of years, the more likely you are to recommend Providence to a friend. This is the results that were taken on site at the event. Next slide is the same cross-tabulation for the online results. And again, people that have been to WaterFire more often are more likely to give a higher score to the question of would you recommend a friend to come to Providence? And then we put the two together to see what the correlation is. And I was quite taken by the fact that it's almost a direct correlation. The more times you come, the more likely you are. It's almost a 1-to-1 ratio. We're not necessarily showing causation here, but we are showing a direct and very clear correlation between the two. Okay. One thing that we were a little bit surprised to find was that there's very little difference between the local response and the visitor response. So the pie charts that you're looking at are the Net Promoter Scores for locals on the left, visitors on the right. And you'll see the proportions are very, very similar. So what this is telling us is that your impression of Providence doesn't seem to be that correlated to whether you're resident here or whether you're coming in for the event. We thought there'd be more of a difference. Turns out, not so much. So then we started looking at the qualitative answers to the question, why did you give that score? On the 1 to 10 chart, why did you give that answer? Why would you or would you not recommend a friend to come to Providence? This is the combination of all the answers for WaterFire. So this is the online and the on-site. I'm not sure if you can quite see the ones at the bottom, but those big 3 bars on the left, the answers given there were water fire, the variety of activity that happens in Providence, and the urban fabric. So that's things like the architecture of the city, the ability to get round, the parking, the feel of the city, the environment as you walk around. We were quite interested in those results, but one thing that kind of came out is that somebody would give the variety of activities in Providence as a very strong reason why they would recommend a friend. They give a 9 or a 10, and they'd say there's so much to do in Providence. Somebody else would give the same reason for a low score. So they would say, I would never recommend a friend to come to Providence. There's nothing going on here. It's the same reason. So what we tried to do from this is pull out the how that kind of just tease it out a little more. So this slide is the same question, why would you recommend a friend or not, for the promoters. And you can see again, water fire, variety, urban fabric. Those are the reasons that people who would recommend Providence would do so. What's interesting is when you look at the detractors to Providence, the 2 things that really stand out there, excuse me, are the variety and the safety. So what we're finding is that people that don't recommend a friend to come to Providence are doing so because the place doesn't feel safe and there's nothing to do. The people that are recommending Providence are doing it because it feels safe and because they think there's a lot to do, including water fire. So there's something there that needs teasing out a little bit more to find out what's going on. So just to summarize that a little bit, what affects people's loyalty to the city? Water fire, fortunately, came up very strongly. Water fire is making a big impact on the city. The variety of things to do, often it's about the restaurants, the nightlife, the history of the museums here. For better or for worse, is a strong factor. Sense of community, the fabric of the city, the ease of navigation and the safety. These are the key factors that are impacting on people's decision-making process. We looked at what else people do when they come to water fire. This is moving a little bit more into the economic impact territory. We're wondering what else happens when you come down to water fire. Turns out it's not just about spending money. Also turns out that the more often you come to water fire, the more likely you are to stick around and do something afterwards. And it turns out that on the non-water fire nights, the reason you go down to Providence is because of the nightlife. So just to show that in a couple of graphics, another Wordle. What else do you plan to do? Turns out dinner. You come to water fire, it's pretty obvious why people are coming. People come to the mall, people shop, people go for a drink, but the main thing they do after water fire is they go and get some food. This we found quite an interesting and stark result. What you're looking at is a pie chart showing what people do by Net Promoter Score. So on the left are the promoters. These are the people that would recommend Providence who come to water fire. After they've been to water fire, they do a range of stuff. They get food, they go shopping, they go for a drink. The detractors, the people that aren't recommending Providence, they come to water fire and they go home. They're not doing anything else. And again, we're not necessarily showing causation here, but we're showing a really strong correlation. To show that in another way, this is showing will you spend money in Providence before or after water fire? So we kind of group this together, dinner, going shopping, getting a drink, these are all together. More people are doing so than not. People that come to water fire don't just come to water fire, they spend money in the bars, the restaurants, and in the shops. Okay, Nate,
Great.
I'll take this and talk about what comes next.
Sure. So in terms of next steps, we have some very immediate ones and then some sort of wish list ones. So just on the wish list, I'll get that out of the way first. It would be really great to know what other kinds of events have this sort of impact on people coming to the city and people who live here. So, you know, for instance, do sporting events have a similar impact? You know, do they make people more loyal to the city? Performances, museums, and other things like that. So that's sometime down the line. Hopefully, we'll be able to have those comparisons. But sort of more in the short term, one thing that we're hoping to do is measure some self-reported and instrumented sentiment collection. So basically, what that means is, well, we'll get to that in a second. And then hopefully you'll be able to actually try this. If you sign up for our event on Saturday during WaterFire, we'll actually be doing a little bit of an experiment with this sort of collection of new data. So to get into a little bit more of what that looks like, we'll be modeling it very closely after this other experiment that happened as part of the BMW Guggenheim lab. So this happened in Mumbai, in Berlin, and in New York. And basically how it worked was a group of people went on a guided tour of the city to various different types of places, parks, highways, street corners, lively streets, dead streets, those sorts of things. And all along the way, they measure their skin conductivity, which is a fairly standard measure of sort of your level of psychological stimulus or excitement or stress, however you want to say it. And then they also answer mini surveys that are geotagged. So all of that is collected into a series of points, which you can see on the image to the left there. The little yellow dots are each point. And then this graphic is great. It's actually graphed sort of the level of stress at different locations. So we will be doing a very similar thing. However, we won't have the skin conductivity devices since they're a little bit hard to get a hold of. But if you go to the next slide, we will be using the same software for the surveys, which is called EpiCollect. It's completely free to use, easy to set up, and essentially they're geotagged, time-dated mini surveys. And we'll be asking people to report their level of stress and also their mood in relation to specific locations. And we'll be doing this at WaterFire. So hopefully what we'll be mapping is the effect of WaterFire on the built environment, and we'll also be gathering a few comparatives of other parts of the urban fabric at the same time. So for instance, we'll be starting in the mall. We'll grab some data from there before we head down to the basin. And also, that's one side of the experiment. The other side is we'll also be doing a sort of more free-form version of the same thing. So rather than a guided tour, we'll actually be sending out timed text messages to whoever signs up for this part of the experiment that will prompt you to answer the EpiCollect survey wherever you are. So we won't be on a specific path, and it'll be less controlled, but hopefully it'll give us a little bit of a broader view of what kind of emotional landscape WaterFire is causing in downtown Providence. Okay. And so this is another app that collects similar data. It's very useful in the sense that it collects this sort of data in aggregate. However, the reason why we aren't using it for this sort of future piece of research is just that it's a little bit harder to sort of to control it, to cut off a chunk of data and say, these are the people that were doing it, this is when it happened, this is where it happened. But it's also a pretty interesting measure of the emotional impact of the built environment.
We started out with this big question, what does WaterFire do for Providence? We've seen some of our answers. We've talked a little bit about economic impact. More interesting in some ways is the notion that WaterFire encourages loyalty to the city. Companies like to talk about brand loyalty. Maybe we should be thinking about city loyalty. It makes people like the city more. That seems important. We see that in our studies. In short, what it really is about placemaking. It fulfills a lot of what the definitions of creative placemaking calls for. That's what we have found so far, again, in our very preliminary studies. We're looking forward to doing more.